In a characteristically crackpot Oval Office meeting yesterday, Donald Trump told Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that the border between the two countries was artificial and therefore open to negotiation. In Trump's view, the border looks like it was drew by somebody with a ruler. Actually, as today's guest, historian Kathleen Burk explains, that border was the product of intense and complex negotiation between Britain and the United States. Kathleen and I not only talk about the negotiations that went behind setting this border, but also why Trump is so obsessed with things from American foreign policy in the 19th century, like tariffs, the Panama Canal, annexing Canada, and suspicion of alliances with Europe. As I joked to Kathleen, it's as if Trump has been listening to the audio version of her book, The Lion and the Eagle, but has only gotten halfway through. Kathleen and I also discuss the way that Britain helped the United States in its rise to world domination, and what the relationship between the two countries might look like when neither of them are a superpower anymore. The last point especially interests me, as I'm curious about what unique British views or approaches to the world might reassert themselves when Whitehall no longer needs to take Washington's lead. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. Kathleen Burk, thank you very much for being a guest today.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to start with my questionnaire. What is your favorite word?
Plangent.
Nice. What is your least favorite word?
How much time do you have? I don't really have a least favorite word. I mean, I can't actually. Fuck. It's so unimaginative.
So the next one was going to be, what's your favorite curse word?
My mom used to say hell's bells. So favorite, damn. How's that?
Has anything about Anglo-American relations in the last few months prompted you to use it?
Yes. I was using it this morning, in fact, over my yogurt and fruit. It is, I mean, it only listened to a part of Joe Biden this morning because it was painful. But presidents don't speak like that. Yes. Countries don't act like that. Yes. Sacrificing sorry, I've got both passports, but I feel much more English than American. In this case, he is destroying what the U.S. has taken the past, 80 years, 80 years, 75 years to build up. And it's gone in 2 months. Who will ever trust the United States again? How can you have agreements when you don't know if they're going to be ripped up in 17 days? Who would trust the U.S.? And who's going to fill the gap? And we all know who's going to fill the gap. That gap is already partly filled. No one's been paying attention to Chinese military developments, both in China and, of course, in Latin America and parts of the Pacific. And all of a sudden, we're going to be in real problems, and Trump will say it's all Biden's fault.
Yeah, I've been listening to the audio book of a new biography of Metternich, and there was a perfect line that sort of described, it was sort of Metternich to Napoleon, saying, your peace is never more than a truce. And I felt like that really applies to Trump and his deals. Like, they're only ever a truce between the next attempt at something else. What is the sound or noise that you love?
Vocal music of the 17th century and viols.
Nice. What is the sound or noise that you hate?
Boy racers.
What is your favorite book?
Homer,
No.
Iliad and the Odyssey.
Mm.
That's my
Um,
desert island.
I, I love the Odyssey. I always struggle with the Iliad.
Well, without the Iliad, there's no Odyssey.
Mm.
So think of it that way. Think of it as chapter, book one and book two. But no, no one likes, well, Trump may. Most people, I will say this carefully, are not keen on blood and gore and swords and war cries. But Homer does it so beautifully. And there's a new great translation of both of them by Emily Wilson. That's, one came out in 18 and the other one came out this past year. And I mean, the thing is, there is a reason that the Odyssey is a classic. It is a page turner. It's a great story. And being called a classic is a bit, I suspect, is off-putting to a lot of people. How many don't read Dickens because he's called a classic? You know, I can't do classics. They're boring. They're too long. Life's too short. But Homer triumphs over that. There's a reason it's the Homeric era was uh, the 8th century BCE. It's lasted a long time.
My first introduction was in primary school. We were shown a cartoon version of the Odyssey, um, and then I always remember in sixth form when we were studying it, our sort of teacher pointed out that what a great literary technique it was that you don't meet Odysseus till book 5, and the first 4 books he gets built up in your mind, and that literary trick has just stayed with me since. Of like creating the mystery about the main character for several chapters before you actually meet him.
Especially though, if you haven't actually read the Iliad. I mean, one of the Wilson descriptions of him is brilliant. It says Lord of Lies.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself to be?
I was asked that decades ago by someone at Oxford who was interviewing me for something. I really can't remember, and I can't think it was very important. And I came up with some not ancient, but earlier, Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps, a woman of power whose desires and whose diplomatic ability, and I suspect whose beauty, enabled her to. I mean, she would have four kings, didn't she? Slight tangent. At the end of this week, I have to get the final manuscript of my current book in, and it's a global history of wine. And so I've gone back to the Neolithic period, late Stone Age, to now. And so what I think of Homer right now is his descriptions of Maronian wine and what that did to Polyphemus and so forth. And Eleanor of Aquitaine changed from where Bordeaux wines were exported through her favored port and so forth. So I have in my mind right now the whole of not just Western history, because I've written a lot on Asian wine as well and Latin American wine, and is that Anglo-American relations is extremely important, but there was no America until just the last, I don't know, since when John Cabot left, or Leif Erikson. So if I think of that, I get slightly less worried about, because think of the Persian wars against the Greeks and Hittites taking everything and so forth. There's a lot that has gone on that one hopes, if you place these past 2 months in some context, I can't help but think that in the end, people will provide a balance to what's going on. That I can only hope that the Americans, who are going through difficulties right now with Trump's goon squads out threatening judges everywhere and so forth, that Canada will stand strong. NATO will finally get its act together and will support Greenland and Denmark, and that this time of dark troubles will, as has happened in certain respects throughout history, will bring a balance back.
I mean, on
Sounds like
that.
the end of sounds like at the end of a sermon, doesn't it?
I say on that. Yesterday, at time of recording, Donald Trump met Mark Carney in the Oval Office, uh, and talking about the U.S. Canadian border. He described it as an artificially drawn line, uh, like somebody drew that many years ago with a ruler. And I thought I'd begin by asking, how did that border actually come about?
I wrote 2 chapters on that in an earlier book. It would have been a lot easier had there been a ruler. But of course, the Canadian-American border was the outcome of wars and explorers and desires. Most of it was drawn by the British because the Americans at that time had neither the expertise nor the money nor the men able to do it. And it was drawn by surveyors who went out, surveyed every island, every creek, every inlet. Britain had certain requirements, which was not to let the Americans have certain points that could threaten their Canadian territory, because War of 1812, of course, had just happened, and everyone expected at some point there may well be another one. And they got as far as 1,000 lakes. Think of Minnesota, think of Michigan, think of and then they stopped because after that, neither one of them had particularly had territory. It was still Indian territory or indigenous or Native American territory. And then it was decided in the mid 1840s by both Americans and British were going towards the Oregon Territory. It was decided by the Secretary of State then and the Foreign Secretary then in London that they would draw a fairly straight line to, was it going to be Puget Sound? Who was going to get the head of the Columbia River? So forth. So the eastern part of the border, which is incredibly complex because of all the water involved, no one had any idea where it was, and the whole border as was of course covered by hundreds of feet of trees. So you had to hack your way through the woods before you could actually even start measuring. It had been decided where it was in the treaty ending the Revolutionary War, what degrees latitude and longitude it was going to be, but they couldn't know where they were. So essentially, it was took several years to actually determine what it was, and there was great care. Men died. It was very difficult. And in the end, both the United States and Great Britain agreed on what the border was to be.
Since he returned to the presidency, Trump's obsessions, for want of a better word, tariffs, Canada, the Panama Canal, avoiding entangling alliances with Europe, they seem to have come out of nowhere, but actually they're very, very old concerns of America's. I've even wondered if someone gave Trump an Audible subscription for Christmas, and he's been listening to The Lion and the Eagle, but he's only gotten halfway through. So I sort of wondered if you could explain how US foreign policy transitioned from the sort of 19th century one that Trump admires to the one that he's trying to dismantle.
Well, 19th century, of course, people think of the Monroe Doctrine, which was pretty well ignored by everyone. The U.S. couldn't enforce it because they had no navy, and the Royal Navy, of course, was the real defender of the Americans. France was going to try to take back Canada again. France was going to try to take Mexico and put a prince as the king of Mexico, and fundamentally, they couldn't get supplies over there and so forth. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked by Venezuela because they were trying to take some territory from a British colony there. And Britain was refusing. And the United States, insisted that there was going to be mediation, I guess would be a better term. Britain said, "You have no locus standi. What are you doing there? It's nothing to do with you. It's two sovereign nations, and you have no territory down there, nothing." And Richard Olney, the then Secretary of State, came up with the Olney Doctrine, which says essentially, we have control. We have this we are unbeatable. We have this territory you can't get to. We have all of these resources. There's absolutely nothing. We are in control of this whole, well, essentially, the United States and this area, of Latin America. And the Americans invoked this. The Foreign Office fell about laughing, essentially, wrote back a very Foreign Office sort of type of from high to low statement, of course. And when this was reported in the States, the then president called Congress and said what was happening, and Congress made all sorts of threats, and the president made all sorts of threats. And Britain said, these are the sorts of statements made by someone who is about to declare war. And of course, the following morning, everyone rode back madly because the pulpits were saying this is quite appalling, and the stock market plunged, and they backed off, and then there was negotiations, mediation. And at the end of the day, this mediation, which had judges appointed both sides, backed Britain. So Britain won the battle, and the United States essentially won the war. And from then on, you see 1898, the U.S. drives Spanish out of Cuba and then drives them out of the Philippines, and the U.S. becomes a colonial power. Britain's quite keen because they think, now that America's also a colonial power, they'll essentially stop attacking us for the British Empire. Of course, the Americans never admitted it was an empire. They were just bringing civilization and religion to the Philippines, and the fact they'd been Catholic for the previous, 5 centuries was neither here nor there. Religion was Protestant religion. What Trump, I suppose, got from that part was an entitlement, that naturally the U.S. was right, and other countries had to back down. And if they didn't, well, of course, the Spanish-American War, the American ships stayed in Hong Kong, refueled there. And when the Americans defeated, the Spaniards in Manila Bay, the world, they had to find out by the Pacific Cable, the British Pacific Cable, to get back to both Europe and the United States. So America has never admitted that they couldn't have won the Revolutionary War without French help. They couldn't have taken the Philippines. And this is part of the American background and development of the world power that is not actually emphasized in the United States. The idea that America won the First World War and won the Second World War, first of all, they had to be bombed into both wars. They weren't going to be part of it. Once they were in First World War, they fought, sort of on a quiet part of the line and a skirmish, and that was about it. What they did contribute was the threat of unstoppable rivers of Iowa farm boys to come and fight. Wilson assumed that the United States had the right and the power to impose a post-war settlement at Versailles, League of Nations, which the British supported, but French also fell about laughing. French are very clear about what their national interests are. Second World War, they weren't going to join. Obviously, the Americans contributed a great deal to the war. Again, Lend-Lease, although Britain contributed £6 billion of Lend-Lease to the $6 billion to the Americans, which is never admitted, of course. Tin from Malaysia and all that sort of thing the Americans did not have. And then an American decision that they would stay in Europe. What Trump doesn't like, of course, no country likes to have to moderate its own requirements to accommodate the wishes of an ally. This is not surprising. Britain didn't like it, but one of Britain's great, besides the Royal Navy, Britain's greatest power, one might say, over the past several centuries, is the ability to construct coalitions. Think Napoleonic Wars, first coalition, second coalition, third coalition. Think in the First World War, putting together coalitions so that in the sense of getting, bringing on the Jews and so forth. NATO was a British idea. It was drafted by Nicholas Henderson, who then was a young member of the British Foreign Office. When the permanent secretary of the British Foreign Office was visiting Kissinger, and the Russians made an offer of some sort of nuclear agreement, he asked Henderson to draft it because he would be better than anyone in the State Department. So there has been a reciprocal relationship in many respects. Britain contributed territory, both to station the bombers in the UK, because American bombers, 1949 Berlin blockade, could not reach Russia from the US. They liked the territory around the world. One member of the CIA said to Ken Philby, which is in his memoirs, whenever we want to destabilize a country, Britain has a handy island nearby. So the Americans were really cross when Britain withdrew from the empire, especially east of Suez, because they depended on them to have other white men having their flag, and they depended on their territory. So Trump not realizing the continuing dependency on the United States on its allies is also, except for those really involved in this sort of thing, is an ignorance that is carried on from an earlier time, an unwillingness to modify one's own requirements and desires, an unwillingness to assume that they could not do it alone, and an unwillingness to accept that money and military power isn't everything. The greatest source of soft power in the world, I think, for any side, is the BBC, World Service. Even Saddam Hussein used to listen to it, find out what's going on in the world. The head of Syria, Assad, listened to the World Service, let alone all peoples around the world. So what Trump has done is destroy the soft power that the United States had built up through movies and television, and of course Lend-Lease and Coca-Cola and General Jollity, and that's gone. That has just gone, and that is a turnaround, something he has that he does not get from American tradition.
I mean, I've always felt that Trump is the most, I guess, the most extreme and ugliest iteration, I guess, of a trend in American foreign policy, maybe since George W. Bush, and continuing with Obama, of a sort of feeling that allies are encumbrances. America can have more of a free hand if it wasn't, bothered by European allies, bothered by Asian allies. The consistency of Bush, Obama, and Trump has been this: if America can just shed its allies, it can accrue more power. And I guess an interesting thing I always found about the Biden administration, and Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken wrote a lot about this, that allies actually extend American power. They don't inhibit American power.
Well, that's obvious, I should have thought. Someone, I think, in the administration, or what's left of the hollowed out State Department or whatever, is ensuring that American troops remain in Estonia, for example, and in Germany. Can I propose one theory that I've held for quite some time, especially in terms of Anglo-American relations? It is always thought that they depend on who the leadership is at that time, and the relationship with the leaders of other countries. I mean, the embarrassing vision of Brown whipping through kitchens to try to get have a word with Obama, for example. But it has always seemed to me that leaders come and go, but bureaucracies and militaries remain. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy have interoperability. They know each other's children's names, and especially having worked through NATO in Europe. The same with the Army. Very close friends between members of the Joint Chiefs, for example, and the Chiefs of Staff in the United States. Friendships, literary, business not so much, because the Americans are ruthless, and their legal system is undependable. And those, I think, would take a generation to go. I mean, granted, Trump is wiping out all levels of, from secretaries of state, or secretaries of education and so forth, down through several levels, assistant deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, and so forth. But I do think there will be enough left. And I think in intelligence, for example, they're extremely close. And I suspect, as far as possible, they will continue to cooperate because they know how important each other is. America provides SIGINT, signals intelligence, but the British are much better at providing human intelligence, HUMINT, not least because they have had centuries of experience in this, and they have languages, which the U.S. doesn't have to the same extent. Because remember, even in the 19th century, the Americans thought of people in the State Department as cookie pushers, as people who weren't clever enough to be businessmen. So there's never been the respect in the United States for the foreign, the foreign service and so forth, that there has always been over here for the Foreign Office. And Britain has always had an ethos of honesty, that over the years it's much better to be able to be trusted than, like the Italians, not. You're just never quite sure. And like America, not, I suspect now. So there are certain institutional advantages that the UK has, and those involved in those areas in the United States closely appreciate this, know this. And the Americans always says they learned much more from the British cables and whatever than they learned from their own State Department cables. Indeed, I tell my students, if they're involved in doing research, other countries' research on other countries, and don't, for example, read Norwegian, go to the National Archives and read the British ambassadors' cables, because you will learn a lot more of what's actually going on, because you had to be honest, and you had to be clear, you had to be lucid, you had to set out the problem and propose possible solutions. I can't recall which modern president said, when the Europeans come, they present me with problems. When the British come, they present me with solutions. So this sort of relationship is the real foundation of Anglo-American relations. And therein lies my hope. It will continue. But in terms of being able to depend just because you're British on the Americans, that's not been the case for some years. And it's a delusion that leads many British politicians, for example, astray. Think of poor Farage.
To your theory about the leaderships come and go, but bureaucracies stay, Britain and Canada have sort of taken different approaches to Trump. I ironically, I think, conforming to their historic approach to the US. Britain kind of feels it has bigger fish to fry, doesn't want any unnecessary conflict, just wants to get a deal. So Keir Starmer's been more or less appeasing Trump, downplaying the crazy stuff like annexing Canada, whereas Mark Carney, on the other hand, has been more confrontational, says that the relationship with historic relationship with America is over and it isn't coming back, and both countries are going to need to readjust. And so I do wonder if the Starmer approach is more appeasing the leadership, whereas Mark Carney's bet is that the institutional links between America and Canada will win out long term.
Well, I should point out that Britain has not been called the 51st state. It has not been under an existential threat. Also, as I said, the British are used to negotiating. They decided early on, I suspect, what they could afford to give up, like taxing the tech bros. And what their red lines were: no hormone beef and chlorinated chicken and so forth, which the US has to accept that they have now accepted that this cannot be the case. Pharmaceuticals, we wait to see what happens there. Are they going to be able to come in and not precisely take over the NHS? But there are still problems. But yes, and they aren't confrontational because in that sense, they can't win. But they will make sure that there is a deal that Trump can claim as a victory. And in Parliament, Keir Starmer will say, it's a balanced deal. We both came out and won. And everyone knows that Trump will claim it's a victory, and they know what that's worth and so forth. He's already placed himself so much on the table that it's not going to embarrass the UK. Canada is different. There's only 12 million people. On the other hand, it's rather bigger than the United States. I'd like to see them take the Northwest Territories. Carney has outmaneuvered Trump in that the king will come over and open Parliament, which makes it clear that Trump's great friend is actually the King of Canada, and he won't love him anymore if he tries to take over his territory. So Carney knows that they don't have the military force. Things are so integrated. This idea that the US is spending $200 billion that's just stupid. We know this is stupid. He probably knows it's stupid, but there's no doubt that Canada has thrown in its military defense into the American hands. Canada has also put up tariffs to match Trump's. Canada says they don't need anything. Well, the Americans need fertilizer. They need that oil, whether they like it or not. Alberta is unhappy about the approach that Carney has taken because they want to sell their oil. 15% of Canadians have said they'd quite like to be part of America, which of course means that 85% don't. Carney has united the country. There are no American goods at all, hardly, on shelves. Certainly no American wines or spirits. So it's a more complex situation than it might look. But Canada has weapons. And if as people seem to think, Trump respects those who stand up to him and is scornful of sycophants, Canada will survive, I think. They are also, as are other members of NATO, and including Britain, rapidly turning their trade negotiations in other directions. Canada certainly is. Britain, of course, India. And the Pacific trading is becoming more important. So what Trump has done has activated most countries in the world to reassess where their interests lie, where their interests can be disentangled, if possible, from the United States.
In sort of the long history of the relationship between Britain and America, one or the other has been a global superpower. And rereading The Lion and the Eagle over the last week amid the tariffs and the economic fallout and America's exorbitant privilege in the financial world coming under strain. And as you said about sort of countries reassessing the economic entanglements with America, and Trump dismantling America's foreign policy apparatus, it's made me wonder about a third act in the relationship in which neither is the leading power in the world, and what that relationship might look like in the future.
You mean when each other is once again a desirable ally? Because
And
they'll
also
probably
just
face
if
China
when
and
yeah when
shut down
neither
North
is
Korea.
sort of the global superpower and can't impose its view of the world on the other.
It's going to come. It's going to come. American hubris. It's showing, for example, in chips, when Taiwan is indeed, the great center of chips in the world, and they're building a factory in the United States, but they're going to ensure, according to the FT a day or two ago, that the United States is 2 generations behind what they do. In other words, they are going to continue their intellectual and productive monopoly of a product that the American economy cannot do without. So this will be not it's a ferocious hang on of the United States not to let Taiwan be taken over by China. Taiwan's a very clever country. They have to be. Talk about existential crisis. So someone somewhere is actually thinking strategically, but they are not yet thinking of the UK as anywhere near an equal partner. But I think people are also rightly worried about the axis of Iran, China, and North Korea. And a united combination like that is at this point unstoppable by the West if they actually decide to do something ferocious. I don't think that Trump has taken this on board. He thinks all he has to go is go over and have them smile at each other and things will be fine. Their love letters and so forth. It's embarrassing for anyone who has half a brain and reads the newspapers. It's embarrassing. And the sorry, I get really, as someone who has spent her life, academic life, reading and thinking and writing about international affairs, Anglo-American relations, but also European-American relations and so forth. What's happening is just utterly painful to watch. I know there's nothing I can do about it. Thank you for reading Lion and the Eagle. I know the Foreign Secretary read my earlier one, Old World, New World, which is Anglo-American relations from the beginning. That is not a push. But I have no influence. Of course I don't. Even though I have a reasonable reputation in Anglo-American relations, why should I? I've never gotten my hands dirty. Those who have gotten their hands dirty, and those who have favored access in journalism and so forth, may be able to influence. But all I can do is sit and worry. And knowing so much, I am worried.
I mean, one of the many reasons I was depressed in the early hours of the 6th of November was just no interest in solving problems. Just like everything you would associate with, I guess, the reason why people go into politics, of like trying to make people's lives better, try and solve difficult problems, make the world a better, more peaceful place. And then the fact that an administration and a president's coming in that just doesn't care about any of that.
And the Congress.
Yeah. So to my last point is going to be the Suez crisis more or less ended Britain taking a different approach to America on like big foreign policy issues. And then after that, British governments usually adhere to whatever Washington decides. If we do start to see a world in which America is no longer the sort of preponderant power, I'm wondering if there are any distinctly British views of the world or approaches that might start reasserting themselves.
Okay. Suez. Yes, it turned Britain towards Europe. In fact, one of the last, I've taken a look at one of the last documents Anthony Eden left in the National Archives is a memo saying we have to turn towards Europe. Macmillan didn't like this, the following, and he threatened, in fact, the reason that the British got Polaris missiles and then Trident is that he said, well, we've had a good relationship. Let us part as friends rather than as enemies. And that made it quite clear to Kennedy and the Americans that that was going to be the end of an Anglo-American relationship, a close relationship. Actually, Kennedy had already planned to give it to them if he was pushed. But nevertheless, that made it quite clear that the British were determined that if they could not depend on America, they were better off doing it alone. In terms of always doing what the Americans wanted, the Americans were incandescent with rage when Britain withdrew from east of Suez. They really were. They were incandescent with rage when Britain refused to join the Vietnam War. And I remember Johnson saying, all we wanted was a platoon of the Scots Guard bagpipers there, but you wouldn't even give us that. And the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, said, at a cocktail party, even if the Russians invaded Sussex, we wouldn't come to your aid now. But they stood. And so between that and Suez, and then in the 1970s, when the UK was in, had an inflation rate of up to 22% because of government spending and because of the OPEC oil crisis, and was being talked about as a banana republic. The U.S., through its creature, as it were, its institutional help, the IMF, came and forced, they thought, the UK to pull back on public spending and change its way of dealing with their finances. The Treasury had organized things already, and in fact, no money ever came from the IMF. So Britain has always had ways of dealing with this, and yes, they know how far they can push it. They know what I'm starting to sound as though it's the British. The British are so incredibly great that no one can. That's just stupid. But they make the best of what they've got, and they think about things, and they have an institutional memory, which the American State Department does not have, which is very useful. And they're, on the whole, natural diplomats. So you essentially want to know
if there is an increasingly sort of over the long term, a sort of more equal relationship between America and Britain, and Britain starts to act more independently of America on foreign policy, are there any sort of distinctly British views or approaches that will start reasserting themselves away from America?
It's already begun.
Mm.
The reset with Europe. The Americans do not like, Trump does not like that at all, but let's not have all of our eggs in one basket. They can't override Brexit, but they're trying to see if, a defense relationship is the first step. Britain is encouraging, it is increasing its relationships with other parts of the world. They're not treating Australia, they haven't some time, but as they ought to have a closer relationship because of their imperial relationship. I've always thought this was a stupid thing, but how are they going to be grateful for being part of an empire? You know, Britain, in many respects, assumed India would be close because they had been. Well, let's just say this is possibly not the cleverest approach, but they are treating India as an increasing superpower, and they have gotten a good trade relationship, trade agreement, as far as one can tell, by giving up, amongst other things, most of their restrictions on Indian graduate students being able to stay and work for a while, which has been a strong, strong desire of the Indian government. So they are showing more flexibility. The British are. Ramping up defense spending, I think, is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. It's going to be difficult for Labour because of all these promises they made. And the Treasury refuses to show any flexibility. But when it's a question of national security, in the end, they're going to have to break. So yes, Britain will never break ties with the U.S. That would be utterly, terminally stupid. But they have to have, and they're rapidly developing, stronger relationships, trading, yes, but also defense with other countries. And of course, having these other relationships gives them a leverage against the United States as well. So in a funny sort of way, I depend on the Foreign Office as much as anything, and on the institutional power and on the training, but also on Parliament, especially the House of Commons, coming face to face with what might be a reality that they would prefer not to have. There's no point. You can't have a welfare state if you don't have a sovereign state. And that's something I think that has to be impressed on people who of goodwill, and as we all do, wanting to make your people better off and around the world better off. It's what one ought to do, but one can't do it if your decisions are unduly influenced by another country. So that is the position Britain is in now, to reestablish herself as an independent defense and trading and foreign policy power. And the United States, ideally, slowly but surely, coming to terms with the destruction and the damage it has done, and the the dangerous position in many respects it places the United States in. They know that China is a competitor, and a strong competitor, but I'm not sure many people have a clear idea of just how far behind the United States is in its conflict with China. And they're going to need help elsewhere, just as a balance. And when they come to terms with that, we will see a more balanced relationship.
Kathleen Burk, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Very enjoyable.
I want to thank Kathleen again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, rate, and comment. If you would like to buy The Lion and the Eagle, visit the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page. The link is in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to my socials. I really hope you tune in again next time.